Welcome to this recording regarding the statewide special education procedures, some of the releases from July 2018. My name is Ron Russell, and I'm going to be spending some time walking you through some of the changes that have come with this release. This first recording that we'll talk about is going to be focusing on changes in the CHILDFIND section of the manual. And the second recording will talk about some of the other smaller topics that involve change or modification in the manual. Before we start talking about some of the changes, I always like to remind those listening of where to find the state procedures. Right now on screen we're looking at the state website, www.iowa.ideainfo.org, and that is where the state procedures live. So, for example, at the top here you can see the July 2018 procedures are linked there. It takes us right to a page that looks like this, and in there you'll see some other information that's available, including copies of the state matrices, some translations, and things like that. But of primary interest are this link here, which is the State Special Education Procedures. That is the latest version of the very large procedure manual, and that is over 600 pages, so it is recommended that you download that. Keep that on your computer. You can always come here and access it, but navigation is always a little bit quicker if you have it downloaded to your computer. So that is there, and we would recommend that you delete old copies that you may have, for example the 2017 procedures, and replace them with the most current. So that manual is there. Also below that, notice where it says Release Notes. July 1, 2018 version. This is a shorter document that highlights the new releases and the procedures, some of the changes and modifications in language, and those are some of the notes that we're going to be talking through in this recording. I also like to remind people of the format of the manual, what it looks like, and just give you some ideas and tips on how you can navigate through it. You're looking at the current manual right now. You can see it's dated July 1, 2018. And as you delve into this, notice that there is an active linked table of contents, so you see something like this. And as you would scan through your topics in the manual, you can go directly to a section. For example, CHILDFIND would take me right there. Or you can go to a table of contents detail. So if I pick a section, for example, even transition down here, if I click on that TOC detail, you can see it gives me a more broken down version of other topics. And it's very helpful as well because not only are the main sections linked, but the subsections. For example, if I pick one down here, transition from pre-K to K, and I click on that, it's going to take me right to that section. So it's really helpful way of navigating. Also, I would point out to you at the bottom of each page, once you get somewhere in the middle of the manual, you have links down here that will also take you back to either the primary table of contents, or it can take you to the appendix, wherever you would like to go. So if I go back to the manual table of contents, here I am back at the beginning. Also to point out within the manual is Appendix A. There are several appendices. Appendix A is an especially helpful, useful section called the Documentation Guide. And so if I were to go to the table of contents detail there, you can see this is a section that essentially has examples of IEP forms and guidance on how to complete them. So as I scan through here, for example, I can find page B of the IEP. Click on that link. It takes me to a picture, an image of the page, what it really looks like in Web IEP. And you can see that page and notice the blue hyperlinks for various sections of that form. If I click on there, for example, behavior, it takes me to a guidance page. And so you can click on those links. That will take you directly to guidance. It will give you some examples and feedback on how to complete each section. So the appendix is a very helpful section, and again, you can navigate down at the bottom here, these links of each page. I can go back to that appendix table of contents, and enables me to move through this pretty quickly. Finally, I just want to show you a search function on the manual. So you can see if I go up to my tools, I see my little magnifying glass. I click on that, I get a little search box, and so if I type in a keyword or even an acronym, if I typed in, for example, Extended School Year Services, ESYS as one acronym, maybe I'm looking for information on that, and I click the next button, it will take me to a section that finds that acronym or term, whatever term I would type in there, and I can keep clicking next. It's going to move me through and find the different occurrences of whatever keyword or term that I've typed in there. So now let's move into a discussion on some of the changes and modifications that we would see in this current release of the manual. You can see I'm back on the release notes section. That is that summary of changes from this July 1st. And let's take some time to dig into that. As I mentioned earlier, this first video we're going to talk primarily about topics related to the general education context leading into CHILDFIND, into that identification process of students with disabilities, because that is kind of a big chunk of the procedure changes this time. And then our second video will talk about a number of other smaller topics and changes that you'll want to know about as well. But let's start here kind of at the top of our topics in the release notes. Notice there's a link here that says General Education Context. This they're calling this a new section, and what it essentially contains is reorganized information that was existing. But this is giving us some context on the expectation of general education regarding non-disabled children, this idea of interventions within the context of general education, and it takes us into some of that detail. So let's go there. I'm going to click again within your release notes. You'll find links as well that will take you from a topic into some more detail. So let's go there. So again, this is kind of a reorganized section. Let's just kind of glance into it now and see what the contents are. And this is something that would suggest you read through at a later time as well. But the first section, General Education Expectations and Requirement. You can see this is getting into this idea that every local education agency in conjunction with the AA is required by code to attempt to resolve presenting problems, to provide intervention for students who are struggling with the expectations of the core prior to conducting a full and individual education evaluation. So that's not now, while it says that, that's not not saying that we have to wait a certain amount of time to do an evaluation. We know that whenever we suspect a disability, we would jump in and conduct an evaluation to look at eligibility. But this is pointing out that there is an expectation that all students in general ed who might be struggling prior to suspicion of a disability are to have interventions through general education to help resolve some of those issues. As we move down here, we can see what I alluded to earlier, the point at which an agency, whether it be the school district or the AEA, suspect a child as a child with a disability. That's when we initiate consent and conduct an evaluation in a timely manner. This little section brings up that what is probably a familiar concept to you of occasional or incidental. The little section points out that code does tell us that high-quality general education is a responsibility of general educators, and including assistance to students who need that support. The Iowa rules do, though, recognize that there are times where special educators can provide occasional and incidental assistance within general education. The Department of Education has provided guidance on that in the past. And so while that is limited, there is this idea that special educators are sometimes providing insights and strategies and support for students who are still within that general education part of the continuum. And then lastly, in this kind of new reorganized section, there's just reminders that of what general education interventions should look like. We want interventions that are matched carefully to the underlying concerns. We want interventions that are implemented consistently through an intervention plan. looking at documentation of measurable, goal-directed attempts to solve a problem. Communication with parents is always key. Collecting data on that progress of whatever the behavior of concern may be. Considering intervention design, and just implementing systematic problem solving to help us look at the effect of the interventions. Now notice at the bottom here, and we see yellow. By the way, highlighted yellow in the release notes is meant to draw your attention to it, obviously. Often new wording or something that we really want to draw your attention to. But this last little paragraph talks about the fact that these code requirements for general education intervention may be met through systematic problem solving that is talked about as part of the CHILDFIND process, or through a multi-tiered system of support and response. So MTSS and RTI framework. It is pointing out here, in terms of what we have in the code, no specific model is required for gen ed intervention, so long as the requirements of gen ed interventions are met. Next in our release notes are some changes to CHILDFIND procedures and even some of the forms and prompts that we use as part of our evaluation process. And they do relate significantly to this case that we call AW, this AW case that is referring to an administrative law judge decision last year in Iowa. And during that decision, it was determined that in Iowa, or in this case, and this led to significant implications for Iowa, that emphasis was incorrectly placed on this issue of cut scores or significant discrepancy. And so we needed to make some changes within the state to respond to this. And you can see where it says the DE's response here. There is a little section of your release notes, and we can take a quick glance at that gives some excerpts from the decision that came down from the AW case, and those may be helpful for you to look at. I know a variety of special education staff within our AEA special education staff did learn about the AW case last year, and that carried some lessons forward towards how we do our evaluations, but it's going to be helpful for special education teachers and others out there to spend a few minutes taking a look at this as well. So let's click on that link and take a look at some of that information on AW. So these excerpts will be helpful to you in getting a sense of what came down from this legal decision. But what did the administrative law judge say in 2017 about AW? You can see this first sentence, kind of a summary. The Iowa Department of Education shall not require, and the AA and district shall not employ, criteria that make finding disability under IDEA contingent upon existence of a significant or severe discrepancy between the child's performance and age or grade-based standards. So you can see there's some rationale there. There was nothing found in the Iowa Rules of Special Education or the eligibility standards that promoted the use of a severe discrepancy as key in that identification process. Second point there, basing determination on the magnitude of a discrepancy. It was noted that it functionally imposes a severity test on the disability, and there's some inconsistency there in terms of what IDEA tells us. So in other words, this idea of if this disability is not, quote, severe enough, a person may not be eligible, that was found to be inconsistent with some of the ideology in IDEA. And then the last point here, FAPE shall be available to any individual child with a disability who needs special education or related services, even though the child has not failed or been retained in a course or grade and is advancing from grade to grade. And that's from the Iowa Administrative Rules of Special Education. So again, this idea that the finding was essentially saying we cannot, hang our hat completely on a severe discrepancy as a cut score method of looking at eligibility. So there was really a very strong direction. A memo came out to the field, and you can see that right here. Staff shall no longer use or follow as a determinant factor in an eligibility decision cutoffs or approaching a cutoff for discrepancy, times discrepant, discrepancy ratios, percentile ranks as an indicator for significant, not significant discrepancy. Instead, staff should consider the child's unique circumstances and describe and thoroughly consider the adverse effects on a child's performance using a variety of sources, such as achievement, parent input, teacher recommendation, information about the child's physical, social, and cultural background, and adaptive behavior. Now moving down, along with this idea of caution in imposing discrepancy severity kind of a rule, there was also something that came out of AW that there was a change on how we might look at specially designed instruction as applied to eligibility determination. So you can see the statement from AW and then some rationale below. The Iowa Department of Education shall not require, and the AEA and district shall not employ a definition of special education for purposes of determining whether a child needs special education as a result of a disability that excludes instruction adapted in content, methodology, or delivery to meet the needs of a child merely because the instruction is within the capacity of general education. So you can see there's some rationale there. IDEA and federal regs and state rules define special education in terms of what it is, not where or by whom it is delivered. It goes on to say the rationale, the fact that some adaptations are done outside of special education does not support the view that special education excludes all adaptations of the content, methodology, or delivery instruction that are within the capacity of general education. And finally, this last one, the fact that an intervention has been used in general education context during an evaluation process does not mean the intervention cannot become special education. If during an evaluation based on RTI data, a student is found to be disabled and able to progress through the general education curricula only when provided one or more specific interventions that meet needs resulting from the student's disability, then the child is eligible for special education. So, some changes based on the AW case, and some of these were implemented practically in some form changes within the Educational Evaluation Report last year. They're now being officially changed in our state document. So we go here to some highlights of changes here, and what we're essentially looking at are changes in prompts and guidance that address some of the AW issues. So if we look down here, for example, prompts in the EER, notice how some of our lined out items are those words and terms that are emphasizing the need for a significant discrepancy. Now, there still continues to be and should be a discrepancy section of the Educational Evaluation Report. For eligibility, we globally look at progress, discrepancy, and need, and so that is still there. But some of the language that suggested that there must be a significant discrepancy or a rule-based kind of a discrepancy have been removed. So you can see some things lined out regarding that. On the EER directions, again, you see some lined out items here de-emphasizing significant discrepancies. So as we read it now, we would see performance in comparison to peers or standards using a convergence of data. Consider the individual's performance in comparison to peers and or expected performance standard levels. Utilize the numeric data from the discrepancy table as well as other relevant descriptive data to determine whether or not a convergence of data has been established. And so it goes on to talk about a preponderance of data. So while we still are looking at discrepancy, we're looking at how students are performing compared to peers and expected standards. So discrepancy has not gone away, but this idea of presuming that a significant discrepancy must exist for eligibility, that has been a major change in the way we are going to be required to look at eligibility determination. So the number one implication from AW was that discrepancy discussion. The second big item had to do with this idea of beyond general education. Also removed for practical purposes from the forums last year was this item. Which of the above needs, if any, will require services and supports that exceed the capacity and obligation of the general education program and resources? That was removed last year. You might recall that that used to be the final question on the EER, this idea, do we need something beyond general education for eligibility? So references now to the capacity of general education are removed. And some of in our larger procedures document, most of you know that in Appendix B there are some EER samples. There have been revisions there that try to modify that language as well to be in line with the AW case. And so if you look at these two bullets here, kind of summarizes the way we would be thinking of this issue now. If the adaptation is needed for access to the general education curriculum and is based on a child's particular disability-related needs, it is specially designed instruction. So this does open up our thinking a little bit in terms of what specially designed instruction could be and where it's delivered. But notice the second bullet, if the adaptation is part of the general ed's curriculum's allowance for the differing needs of diverse learners, it is part of the general education curriculum. Okay, so we will have some students in the general education curriculum that have a right to differentiation, to intervention as needed. Remember that general education context section that we talked about. And in some cases, adaptations and intervention are part of general education. However, when we get to a point of going through a full evaluation, looking at progress, discrepancy, need, we may have some students with disabilities, and it might be determined that that student does have a need for a particular adaptation, and it might be disability-based. And so this idea that even if that's happening in the general education curriculum, it could be deemed as SDI, specially designed instruction. So other CHILDFIND changes that you'll see, and I would generally recommend that it would be very worthwhile, particularly for AA providers and also special education teachers, to read the new CHILDFIND chapter with these changes embedded in there. I won't read all of these things to you because there's just a lot of wording changes and different things emphasized. One important thing, there was one page, or half page actually, section of the previous procedures called magnitude of discrepancy. That has been removed completely. Some of you will remember that that was the one part of our procedures that did have rule-based ideas for significant discrepancy. Now, while even in the past it never said that those were absolute necessities, it just gave ideas for considering what might be significant. So, for example, in the past, the 12th percentile was one of those examples in the magnitude of discrepancy that might indicate significant. That section has completely been removed based on the AW issues. So we should take a look at, though, eligibility determination is revised to reflect AW standards. So we can take a quick look at this. So when the team gets the point of looking at eligibility determination, this section of the chapter is a nice walkthrough of the considerations that should be looked at. One important question we want to talk about, question number 2, that falls under this section: is special education required to meet the individual's educational needs? And there's some nice statements in here that I think are helpful. This component of eligibility is met when the instructional needs of a child based on his or her disability include adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. And then it says, see the following sections for a discussion of what constitutes special education and SDI. But it goes on to say the component of eligibility is not met when the instructional needs of the child are met by general education's instructions allowance for differing needs of diverse learners. So when we think of things like differentiation for all kids, flexible grouping, remedial programming, maybe even alternate educational programming, we may view those as general education allowances, which are different than specific adaptations or instructional needs that are disability-based. our EER process still will look at exclusionary clauses. We need to, so that remains unchanged. Teams are supposed to look at whether or not the problems are maybe due to lack of appropriate instruction, possibly limited English proficiency, cultural factors, environmental or economic disadvantage. So continuing down, highlighted in yellow here, kind of a nice concise ending statement here. If the team determines that a child has a disability and by reason of that disability needs special education and an exclusionary factor is not the determinant factor, the child may be identified as an eligible individual. Back to our topics list again. This next one I wanted to touch on. When is specially designed instruction needed? A section of the CHILDFIND chapter also revised in light of AW. So let's take a look at that. And thinking about when is SDI needed, it goes back to a topic we alluded to earlier. Teams must consider all disability-related needs in determining if specially designed instruction is needed, and some questions are given there, some questions to consider. So again, this idea of are adaptations based on a child's disability-related needs, are they necessary to address the adverse effects on educational performance? A yes would support the need for special education. But this question, are all the instructional adaptations needed by this individual part of general education's instructional allowance for the differing needs of diverse learners? So going back to that idea of, is it differentiation, flexible grouping, things we might do for all students in the general education context? If it's a yes there, that would not support the need for special education. Some other questions that might help the team think through this idea of, when is SDI needed? Do their needs include the ongoing need for instruction from individuals with specialized professional training or licensure, alternative instructional materials or curricular modifications, adjusted or expanded standards or benchmarks? If we get yeses there, we're again supporting the need for special education. Another question, does the child need time for reteaching concepts on a consistent and frequent basis? More opportunities to master something? A yes would again support the need for special education. This next little section, guidance for children who have a disability but do not require specially designed instruction. The chapter gives us a lot of definitional examples of what a child with a disability refers to. We get a definition of specially designed instruction, and we can look at that here. Again, that means adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child under this chapter, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the child that result from the child's disability, and to ensure access of the child to the gen ed curriculum so that the child can meet the educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that applies to all children. So when we look at the bottom of this page, considerations for initial and reevaluations. Now we know that anytime we do an initial eligibility evaluation or a reevaluation, we're looking at whether or not that child is an eligible individual. So look at these summary sentences here, and let's start with initial. When as part of an initial evaluation, a team of qualified professionals and the parents is considering the needs of a child with a disability, the team may not, I wish that were bolded there, may not determine the child to be an eligible individual unless the child's needs include specially designed instruction. Okay, there are some significant implications there to that statement. It is saying that a child is not an eligible individual under IDEA and under Iowa procedures unless they have a need for specially designed instruction. So are there students who have documented disabilities of different kind, ADHD, other kinds of disabilities that may not require specially designed instruction? The answer is yes. And so these statements are reminding us that while disabilities may exist, if SDI is not required based on the evaluation data, a child is not an eligible individual. And let's consider reevaluation. Similarly, when as part of a reevaluation, a team of qualified professionals and the parents determine that a child's needs no longer include specially designed instruction, the team must determine that the child is no longer eligible regardless of other needs related to the child's disability. Notice the language there. That is not saying a child's disability has gone away, but if for various reasons, if a child undergoing a reevaluation no longer needs SDI, then the team would look at that child as no longer eligible. Next section. I think these are helpful ways of thinking through what we just talked about. Examples and non-examples of eligible individuals. It points out not meant to be an exhaustive list, but to help us get some perspective. So let's just walk our way through these. I think these are helpful. Example of an eligible individual: a child who has a disability and requires services of an itinerant teacher of the deaf of hard of hearing, which is specially designed instruction, is SDI, and a classroom amplification system, either as supplementary aid or service, for example, provided to enable the child with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate, or as a related service required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. So this is an example of a student who may be eligible. They need SDI, in this example, from an itinerant teacher for deaf of hard of hearing students, and they're also needing a supplementary aid or service, which would be amplification. But here's a non-example of an eligible individual as we think through this. A child who has a disability and requires classroom amplification system to benefit from general education instruction, but does not require specially designed instruction. So again, that key was brought up in other parts of the notes. A key is there a need for specially designed instruction? That is a must, something that must be in place if we're looking at a child as being an eligible individual to have an IEP. So again, this non-example here, if a student requires amplification only, clearly there's a hearing disability, but in terms of special education, if SDI is not required, the thinking is that that student would not be eligible under an IEP. Let's look at a few more here. At the top of our page here, what is showing: example of an eligible individual: a child who has a disability and requires assistive technology and specially designed instruction to utilize and benefit from that technology. Okay, that's an example of eligible individual. Kind of a parallel non-example: a child who has a disability and requires assistive technology only and does not require specially designed instruction. So again, needing SDI is a key there. A few more. Example of an eligible individual: let's look at a child who has a disability and requires physical and occupational therapy services to enhance the motor functioning needs needed to meet the standards applicable to all children, and special transportation, which is a related service. Okay, so the child has a disability. They require OT and PT to enhance their motor functioning in order to help them meet standards. They're also needing transportation. But we'll look at the non-example, kind of parallel: a child who has a disability and requires special transportation only and does not require specially designed instruction. So up here in our example, that PT-OT, we're looking at that student being on an IEP because they would need those services, specially designed instruction, in this case from an OT or a PT, along with transportation. If it was only transportation, that would be not an eligible individual. Now that student very well, we would have a disability. Let's imagine a student who maybe uses a wheelchair, cannot walk. That's clearly a disability, but if that student did not require specially designed instruction, they would typically not be on an IEP. We would not look at them as an eligible individual. And we know that sometimes students in that scenario are covered, their rights are covered, and accommodations are covered under 504 as well. Okay, last example and non-example. Let's just look at one more. A child who has a disability and requires services of an itinerant teacher of the deaf of hard of hearing, which would be a type of SDI, and interpreting services, either as a supplementary aid or service to help that student progress, or as a related service. That would be an example of an eligible individual because specially designed instruction is involved. Non-example would be a child who has a disability and requires interpreting services to benefit from gen education but does not require specially designed instruction. So that would kind of be parallel to our other example of amplification only but not needing special teaching. This shows up as a non-example of an eligible individual. Again, a student in this boat, certainly their rights would be covered. To have necessary accommodations through 504. Schools would need to really carefully consider how they're supporting students, but may not be looking in this scenario at a student with an IEP. Okay, I'm going to stop here on this video. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to use this first video to talk mainly about CHILDFIND topics, particularly as they're related to the AW case. And I think we've accomplished that. There are a few more topics that I'm going to add to a separate video. Some of them are very small clarifications. A few of them will intermingle with CHILDFIND, but I think we've covered kind of the biggies that involve the modifications, quite a few of them, of this CHILDFIND chapter. So we'll end here, and I thank you for listening. And the second video will cover a number of other topics that are reflected in these release notes as well. Thank you.